What Remains of Edith Finch is a game I put off playing for far too long. Fortunately, if you have a PlayStation Plus Extra subscription, you can avoid my mistakes and play it right now. This review will be story spoiler free, but we will be showing gameplay from the whole game, as there are some truly great gameplay sections here that we wish to highlight. We'll be covering a new game every single week in 2023, so if you like what you see here, please consider subscribing. And with that, we're delving into the past to let you know if What Remains of Edith Finch is worth your time.
Anything about the Finch family? You know the stories have at least one thing in common. Someone always dies at the end.
I gotta come clean straight away. I do not find walking simulators interesting in the gameplay department. It just never really appeals to me. Sure, this gameplay serves the narrative best, but it just isn't very engaging. Edith Finch makes things engaging by pulling you away from the walking simulator to other small gameplay sections. It's more akin to the Telltale Walking Dead games than a more traditional walking sim. You do a bit of walking and exploring, then get a gameplay section, then back to walking, exploring, and around to gameplay again. The gameplay is never truly difficult, you just play around with what you're given, and the story comes with that. Of all the gameplay sections, the only one I didn't like from a gameplay perspective was the bath scene, but from a storytelling stance, it's great. On the other side, you have the comic scene, which is gameplay elevated by art direction, and Lewis's part, which is a masterclass in using game mechanics to tell a story. Seriously, the whole game is worth playing just for this one bit. It's that good. This sandwiching technique kept my interest the whole way through. Even walking around the Finch house gave me enough to look at, and I was engaged in the exploration portions as well. The only bit I have to critique is the lack of control prompts. It's pretty quick to figure out what you need to press, but if you're newer to games, then you might hit a roadblock here. This, combined with the lesser gameplay sections, are what knock a point off, and bring this short and sweet gameplay section to a 4 out of 5.
I think Calvin always wanted to fly.
What Remains of Edith Finch is a beautiful game. Environment design is top notch. Every single section here is packed to the brim with details and lit wonderfully. The Finch house feels like an ancient structure that is melded by the family. The external locations all have their own identity, and there are even a few art style changes that are pulled off wonderfully. Objects are low poly models, but this is all brought back up by fantastic lighting. It reminds me of Firewatch, but everything here just looks so much better and even more detailed. The choice to have subtitles be a part of the environment and also a part of the gameplay in certain sections is great. This is a great merging of art direction and narrative. You are told the story in parts, but those parts feel more natural because of this choice. The soundtrack is subdued but perfect for the atmosphere. It never felt like it was getting in the way, and even bolsters certain scenes to make them even grander. Overall, the art direction here is pretty perfect. The game looks and sounds great, but the choices here are made to bolster both the narrative and gameplay to bring the whole package up, and that's what nails it the full 5 out of 5. The narrative is the core of What Remains of Edith Finch. This is a tale about a family cursed with death, and how that curse takes them one by one. The story isn't vague for vagueness' sake. Instead, the weirdness opens up as you explore the past, and it all comes together in the end to create a narrative that gets better the more you think about it. The developers clearly put a lot of effort into creating a story that has a lot of layers, but isn't needlessly confusing. They also put a lot of effort into joining narrative to gameplay, going even further to wrap in the art direction. The environments do a great job at telling stories. Things that happen in the past remain in the future, and it lends credit to parts where narration might be unreliable. There are plenty of details to look for in order to explain the curse, but the almost supernatural element of some of the flashbacks don't feel too far-fetched, and might have you believing the curse exists for yourself. Each narrative section utilised simple gameplay to facilitate telling the story in an interesting way. A Tale of a Hungry Child has you playing as a bunch of different hungry animals, a cheesy 50s horror death has you playing through a comic book, and Lewis's section literally gives you Lewis's mindset through gameplay. This is a narrative that could have been a book, but is elevated immensely by being a video game because it uses the gameplay to drop you into the narrative. Overall, this is a story that drops you right in with the characters, but also has a mystery to keep you engaged in the flashback sequences, even though you know the general way they will all end. This is the central pillar of Edith Finch, and it is easily the strongest, netting the full 5 out of 5.
The palace would be packed with his companions.
What Remains of Edith Finch is a full content package that is technically sound. We experienced no bugs whilst playing. Content-wise, you're getting a full 2-hour tale. Settings-wise, things are minimal, and this presents a few problems, but we'll get into those later. You can invert your camera and enable a reticle. There are sliders for sound effects, dialogue, and music volume. There is also a brightness slider. That's all the settings you get. The issue I have here is a complete lack of accessibility settings. Walking simulators are usually a pretty good recommendation for newer gamers, and there are some omissions here that make Edith Finch pretty unfriendly if you encounter them. The first is the omission of any sort of control prompts to enable. Even as someone more experienced with games, I had to fiddle around in a few sections to find out what did what. A setting to toggle these would be a nice inclusion if you needed them. The game isn't overcomplicated and does just fine without these prompts, but a setting to toggle them would be a nice inclusion for the people that might need them. I'd also like to talk about subtitle options. The game does direct your camera towards key subtitles, but some more solid options wouldn't have gone amiss. The handwritten font is a nice touch for the story, but in the moment, reading it can be tough. I think another option to enable more standard static subtitles at the bottom of the screen would have gone a long way for improving accessibility. I think accessibility in games is massively important, and whilst these issues aren't massive, and the game does fine without the options, I am going to drop a point because these are issues with workarounds that just aren't present and have the potential to make the player miss elements of the game. Overall, What Remains of Edith Finch is getting a 4 out of 5 in our specs section. Content and technical soundness are fantastic, but settings are lacking, and I think the fixes I listed could make the game more accessible for a larger audience without necessarily being too much work.
Of all the stories people wrote about Barbara's death, I'm surprised Edie saved this one.
What Remains of Edith Finch took me 90 minutes to complete. That's shorter than most movies. The game has a wonderful respect for your time. You can break the game up, but I'd recommend treating the game as a full experience and setting aside the time to play through the whole thing in one go. Once you complete the game, you also have the option to go back and play chapters at your leisure. This is a really nice inclusion if there's something you want to go back to without having to go through the full game again. Hard drive footprint is also wonderfully tiny, clocking in at just under 3 GB. This is friendly to your hard drive and your internet speed. I have no complaints here. What Remains of Edith Finch has a solid respect for your time and hard drive, and deserves the full 5 out of 5 on our commitment scale.
For someone who'd never known success in the real world, I think it was overwhelming.
What Remains of Edith Finch is a masterpiece, and absolutely worth the couple of hours it asks from you. I really do regret putting off playing it for so long, and the more I've thought about it after playing, the better it gets. This is the sort of experience that is far more than the sum of its parts.